So I think people have had time to enter our virtual room. I'm very happy to welcome you to what is our first OECD Berlin Center and our Economic Research Institute network event with institutes in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And we are already going international with an event, with a particularly interesting event, I think. We're going to have a dialogue with Denmark, looking at our recently published economic survey Denmark, which focused on climate policies in that our neighbor's country. And because Denmark is so successful, we thought it would really be interesting also from a perspective with a new government, with a strong focus on climate policies here as well, to see a little bit what happened in Denmark and what we in Germany, but also other countries can learn. And for that, we'll have a little introduction by Andrew Barker, my former colleague, I have to say. He was the main author of this survey and is going to present its main results. And then we have sort of a German-Danish dialogue with, on the Danish side, Ida Auken, who's a parliamentarian in Denmark, and she's also a member of the Climate Policy Committee in the Danish Parliament. Jürgen Elmeskov, who for full disclosure was for many years my boss at the OECD Economics Department, is now in the Danish Climate Council alongside many other responsibilities as a former chief statistician in Denmark. And he just told me he now engages with the Norwegian Statistical Institute, so much expertise on climate and how to read the statistics around it also. And from the German side, we have Katharina Beck, who's a German parliamentarian and with much expertise in green economic policies also. And Wilfried Rickels is from our partner institute, the Kiel Institute of World Economics, very close to Denmark. So maybe he's looking over the border sometimes. And he's of course also a climate policy economist, climate economist, and can tell us a lot from that side. But without further ado, I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully it will work so that Andrew can tell us more about the economic survey. So let's see. From beginning, do we have the presentation? Nope. So
thanks very much, Nicola. That looks good.
Okay, so I'm in your hands and you can talk now.
Thanks very much. So I will begin with the usual disclaimer that I will be expressing my views rather than those of the OECD, particularly as I've just finished up at the OECD. But that said, this presentation will draw heavily from the 2021 OECD Economic Survey of Denmark, where I was the head of desk working on that. And as Nicola has mentioned, that had a very strong climate focus. So we had 2 chapters of 3 focusing on climate policy, drawing from all the work going on climate policy across all of the OECD, and also in particular a framework paper on assessing climate policies in OECD countries that was going on in parallel, so drawing from that as well. So starting here with the key messages, thank you, Nicola. 3 sort of key points to bring out is that firstly, as is probably well known to the audience, Denmark has made impressive progress in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in deploying renewable energy in the energy sector. That said, there are still significant challenges to meet ambitious targets. So Denmark has a target to reduce its emissions by 70% from the 1990 level by 2030. Which will still be challenging, and emissions neutrality by 2050. So a key finding from that is that effective policy will therefore be critical to avoid significant negative socio-economic impacts from this ambitious climate policy. So for my first figure of this presentation, that one. So we can see here that Denmark has cut emissions by more than the OECD average. So the dashed lines, with Denmark being in red and the OECD average being in green, the dashed lines are based on production-based greenhouse gas emissions, which is the standard UNFCCC way to measure emissions based on the emissions that are actually to basically the emissions in the Danish territory. But also shown on this chart in the solid lines is the demand-based emissions, which includes the emissions embodied in imports into Denmark or other OECD countries, and excludes emissions embodied in exports. And important point there is that Danish emissions have reduced in terms of a demand-based measure as well. So it hasn't just been a matter of Denmark shifting its emissions intensive activity abroad. There have been real reductions in overall emissions. So if we go on to the next slide, in Denmark, as in other OECD countries, including Germany, Denmark has been successful in reducing emissions while maintaining economic growth. So we can see while carbon dioxide emissions per capita have substantially declined, GDP per capita has continued to grow quite strongly. And also this abatement has not come at the cost of big job losses. You know, Denmark continues to have low unemployment. We go on to the next slide, which is one of our favourite charts in doing this work, to show the historical success Denmark has had in reducing emissions, and also the scale of the challenge ahead with the targets in 2030 and 2050. So if we look at the red area, that's the energy industries, and you can see the extent to which emissions have been reduced from a shift from a largely coal-based energy sector, the really strong shift towards renewables. And if we look at the top of the top line at the top of the blue area, that is total emissions from Denmark, you can see there's been considerable success since the mid-1990s in reducing emissions, and just a small acceleration needed to meet the 2030 goal. But I guess the key thing is that progress to 2030 needs to be broadened, and the structural adjustment challenge goes far beyond just the energy industries. That it will need to be a broader range of sectors that now cut emissions, because the margin for action in the energy industries has largely been exhausted. And so this slide reflects that at the OECD, we are increasingly concerned about the political issues and the political economy about climate action. So you only need to cite examples like the Gilets jaunes in France, or the very quick voting out of governments in Australia that brought in an emissions pricing scheme, to see that this can be a big political issue. So we show here new survey analysis that shows that there is greater public support for climate policy in Denmark than there is in Germany, France, and the United States. The Germany results, so this is this new survey analysis done by the OECD. The Germany results are hot off the press, so this is something new, and we can see that there is stronger support generally in Germany for climate policies than in France and the US, but less than in Denmark, and also
Except
in
for
Denmark,
cars.
and also, pardon me?
Except for polluting cars in city centers, no? It's a bit different for Germany. Yeah.
Yes,
Maybe
exactly.
for
It looks more like
understandable reasons.
the attraction to conventional vehicles looks more like the United States, exactly. And also in Germany, as in Denmark, there is less acceptance of price of taxing fossil fuels. So we think that's quite important. I mean, we point out in the economic survey that an emissions price is the most efficient measure to reduce emissions, but it's important to bring the public along and to compensate the vulnerable. Of course, a big benefit of emissions pricing is it provides revenue to compensate vulnerable households and to support competition. So that's really important to bring the public along there. And also an interesting question that perhaps we can discuss more, but is the question of why is support for climate policy higher in Denmark than these other countries? There is clearly strong trust in government, interest and knowledge of environmental problems, which are things that I guess take a long time to build up. But I think an important factor that we identified through the course of the survey was the key role of independent bodies. So the Council on Climate Change, the Environmental Economics Council as part of the Economics Councils. They have a broad remit. They assess government policy on climate and provide recommendations on policy. Sometimes they're critical, quite critical of the government, but the Danish government continues to maintain and to fund these independent bodies that continue to point out the economic case and the important case for action on climate change. So we thought that's important. For my final graphic for my presentation, I'll come back to this point of Denmark deploying renewables a lot more quickly than the OECD average. So that's come about from a complementary combination of ambitious national targets for renewables, strong and consistent support for research, development and deployment of renewables, and also one that we think is important is its streamlined planning processes. So there's a study that showed that the average time to consent an offshore wind development in Denmark is 16 months. In Germany, that takes on average 3 years. Offshore and onshore wind have been the biggest sources of new renewables in Denmark, driving this trend in the red line. But biomass has also expanded, which you can see by that growing gap between the dashed and solid red lines. Some of this is agricultural waste, which is a great opportunity to utilise agricultural waste, but most of it is woody biomass from forests, much of which is imported into Denmark. So the shift from coal to biomass has clearly cut emissions in the energy sector in Denmark, which is a very good thing. But we also raised some concerns in the report that the scientific analysis has increasingly challenged the notion that woody biomass is truly carbon neutral once you account for the regrowth, but also the drying and the transport of the biomass. And also there are scarce supplies of truly sustainable biomass. And as technology has improved in other renewables and in heat pump technology to use renewable electricity for heating, then it makes sense to use those scarce biomass supplies for other harder to abate sectors or indeed for other countries. So we welcome the steps that the Danish government has taken to allow biomass to be replaced in district heating, and we call for more work to include the environmental effects of biomass in policy incentives, and to provide market-led solutions for the private sector to deploy other renewables, particularly through large-scale heat pumps, which is something that's been done in Sweden in particular. So now I'm on to this is the final a summary of some of the key recommendations in the report. This is a subset, and it's obviously quite high level. We provide more specific recommendations, particularly in the chapter on the sectoral issues in energy, transport and agriculture. But there's 3 points I'd like to highlight here. So the first is we really emphasise the need for certainty to underpin climate policy, to underpin investment as soon as possible, which is very important with goals as soon as 2030, which will come around very quickly. The second is on emissions pricing. We highlight and we emphasise as the first priority the need for uniformity of emissions pricing, so really to get the low-hanging fruit, rather than a specific high price, which might be difficult without bringing the public along. we don't favour doubling up of prices for facilities already covered by the EU emissions trading system. And then the third point, reflecting the public acceptability concerns that we've talked about, it's very important to offset distributional and at least temporarily competitiveness effects of climate policy. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present some of an overview of our work, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew, for this quick discussion, and I'm sure we can go in more depth into some points. And before I go to the more policy-related discussion, I think I want to ask Wilfried Rickels from the Institute of World Economics about your assessment. So you're, of course, a climate economist. You look at these things from a theoretical point of view, but you're also with the Kiel Institute close to the Danish border. And so I think it would be interesting to see your point of view. Do you think it's useful to look across that border? Are there important lessons from Danish climate policies? And would you say, as a climate economist, that Denmark is really ahead of Germany in some ways, or is it difficult to compare because of the size of the countries? What is your perspective on that?
Well, thank you. First, I would say if you have an opportunity to learn, you should always use it. And these cross-country comparisons are, I would say, very helpful. Climate policy and energy policy are very complex issues. And for many problems, even we studying it, we do not know ex ante what to do. So having this kind of empirical data is very helpful. And I would like to warn to not make the mistake to get too strong in rankings, to say they did it better, we did it wrong, they did it right, or we did it wrong. For certain questions, you did not know what was the right policy in the beginning. And if we now learn, for example, from Denmark, that something worked out well, that could have been by chance or by other interactions. So I really would like to emphasize the learning and not the blaming aspect of these comparisons. And that brings me then to my second point in terms of ahead, that then actually are these interactions. So I really like this presentation. So Denmark has a remarkable increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And when you only look at carbon emissions, 38%, I think since 1990, Germany only 33%. But if you go the other way around and look for consumption-based emissions, which are more difficult to calculate, Germany had even a higher reduction. So they reduced by 28% compared to 17% in Denmark. So, and of course, for the climate, the global emissions matter, and you always have to think about these interlinkages. And as we are talking about global emissions, we are in Europe here on the way to it. We have the European emission trading scheme. So 30% of the emissions in Denmark are under this scheme, 40% of the emissions in Germany. And here's the idea to reduce it on the European level, do it there where it's most efficient, and go a bit away from this country perspectives. And therefore one would actually then look at so if you really want to go into what can we learn in terms of success, you have to go to the non-ETS sectors, where Denmark has their different policies than Germany, and then something we will probably discuss later in more detail. If I remember correctly, I think they have already since 1992 a carbon tax on households and building and transport emissions. And we just in Germany started recently with a carbon tax on this non-EU ETS emissions.
Yes, thank you, Wilfried. And perhaps from this, more theoretical or also more global perspective, I want to go back to Danish policies, and in particular, either this slide where we saw that there seems to be a lot of acceptance in the Danish population for climate policies, and I've also heard, I think from Andrew and from others, that there's this broad political consensus in Parliament, a cross-party consensus. You're also a member of the Climate Committee, that this agenda has to be pushed forward. Is that, would you say, something unique to Denmark? And How did you do this? How did you achieve this?
I think, thank you first of all for inviting, and it's a very interesting report. So it was also fascinating for me again to see this perspective from the outside. To answer your question, I think that this support has a long history, because when we were hit by the energy crisis in the 70s, we actually, as a country, decided to put in a lot of measures in our buildings, like you mentioned, standards for building codes, for how the heating system should work, energy savings, and renewables. So the whole society kind of grabbed that 70s crisis and used it for our benefit. So I think what the Danes have been seeing for now 50 years is that we can create jobs by transforming things, by being first movers in transforming sectors. We've really benefited a lot. So of course, in the 90s, why did we keep supporting wind energy when it was expensive and it went wrong and it was difficult? Well, I think it was some of the learnings from the 70s on Danfoss, Grundfos. Some of our biggest companies actually came out of this crisis. So for us, the combination of green jobs, efficiency, life quality, and leading in a green transition has become more or less part of our DNA and very widely accepted. Also, I think is very important in our industries.
Yes, thank you, Ida. And Jürgen from the Climate Council already raised his hand, has something to add, but I also have perhaps you wanted to answer that question, but I'm going to raise that question as well, Jürgen, because of course there's a lot of impressive success of climate policies in Denmark, but of course there are also challenges ahead. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about both so that we have the full picture.
Indeed, I'll look forward to doing that. Let me just begin by, as it were, reinforcing the point made by Ida about the political environment or the broader popular environment for climate policies in Denmark. I think what we have experienced in Denmark actually demonstrates what the OECD has been saying in its own research on the political economy of various types of reforms, that it is extremely important to build a constituency in favor of reforms. And I think Danish climate policy is an example of very early on building such a constituency. As Ida mentioned, there are a lot of people who have jobs building windmills or doing insulation of houses, etc. And there are lots of enterprises active in those areas. And that means very early on, there was a very vocal constituency in favor of ambitious policies. So I just thought I would reinforce the point made by Ida based on OECD research, actually.
Can I add just one thing here to what Jan is saying? Thank you for agreeing. Well, is that if you look at the sectors where we really made some transformation, it is the energy sector. And that is the sector where we've had a broad political agreement for many years. So we've actually had energy deals, agreements that were bipartisan or actually with very broad participation of parties for, I think you know that better than me, but I think at least 20, maybe 25 years, we've had some kind of agreement on this sector. And sometimes coming from the left and the more ambitious, we've wanted to move faster, but we haven't been able to move just as fast because we wanted the other side to be there. They've been more economically conservative, but maybe also had some very important points of not making too many mistakes on the way. But what we've seen is that the agricultural sector, and that's also what you see on these slides, has not moved in the same sense that the energy sector has. The transportation has been flat out not transforming at all. And that's, of course, different issue because you need the whole car industry to transform and all of that. But being a strong agricultural country, I think because we did not have this wide policy agreement, we did not transform as much. And we just recently, last year, 2021, we made this broad agreement now, which also contains a lot of compromises, and some of the more left-wing parties having to compromise on their ambitions and their goals and the speed of the transformation. But I think it's very, very important for this transformation to happen that both sides politically are on board.
That's indeed very, very interesting, and perhaps leads me to Katharina, who is a member of parliament for the Green Party, so in one of the parties that are in the government coalition. There's a lot of ambition, of course, to push forward with climate policies. But Katharina, you also have a lot of experience with what Jürgen told, building the constituency for climate policies, because you're a member of the Economic Council of the Green Party, right? So you've engaged a lot with business also on these issues. And yeah, perhaps your perspective, just what do you think, can you learn from Denmark? Perhaps also what kind of questions do you have as you're starting with your new ambitious program into this 4 years of a new government? Would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being able to be here and also taking up this invitation. I already in preparation, let's say, had to learn from Denmark, which was really, really great. And one example was that I'm still surprised, but I do believe that your climate law is already in place since 2000, right? And in Germany, we have just come up with a climate law in 2018. So, I mean, that's a bit on the time span, how much apparently regulation has been a bit behind. And so very happy to see that. We have now a new government that sees that issue. And it's not only the time lag because of the climate law, but also that we are, when you look at the electricity and power generation, CO2 price, you've heard it, we are in comparison with Denmark a bit behind. But we have also for ourselves set us ambitious targets, which mean that we want to have 80% of renewable power by 2030. And at the moment we are below 45%, around 45%, 46%. And if we look into the past, so that means that we have to quadruple the speed in wind energy and quadruple the speed in solar power. And one question that I do have is, in Germany, we have planning rules that are quite strong or strict, or how you want to call them. And one of the issues we do have now with speeding up is changing the planning rules. And we have some issues there with regards to population of birds and protection with regards to wind energy, or also planning regulation regarding solar energy on houses. Also, it's quite bureaucratic if you are an individual person to actually build a solar panel on top of your roof, or even a company, as Nicola said. I have been working very closely together with large corporations before I joined Parliament, and I have also been an advisor to the previous parliamentarian group of the Greens in the last legislative period. And some of the people in economics or some of the large corporations in Germany were even mad somehow how difficult it was. So maybe we can learn a bit from planning regulation, but I also want to also how to create more support in the population. That is another question. I do believe one of the answers is happiness. As everybody knows, I believe that hygge and the Danish happiness is famous. And I've done a bit research before our conversation today, and I found that at least the University of Oxford and Jeffrey Sachs say that more sustainability also creates more happiness. Maybe it's a double link. Maybe happier people are more open for change, but also on the other hand, you even support more content people. And it's not only about happy-go-lucky, but it's about being content and positive about life in a way. And I do believe that a positive vision for our continent and for our countries does help people also with Corona at the moment, to get some hope for the future. So it's not just happy-go-lucky, but a true belief that politicians should help make people happier in a way, more content, seeing more hope. And that leads to my third aspect, which is with regards to the taxonomy of investments. And I would like to understand how we could maybe join forces and trying to keep the taxonomy the good instrument that it has been designed to be in order to fuel investments into true green energies and not, for example, nuclear power. And I want to also create some links already here. I do believe it's a bit hard given the EU process, but I don't want to give up at this moment yet.
Yes, thank you, Katharina. Those are a number of aspects, and some of them have already. So let me perhaps work on them one by one and giving them into the group. Where one of them, so the planning procedure, happiness, and taxonomy. Let's put it that way for the beginning. Perhaps the happiness aspect, if I can frame it a little bit differently. So one question that came up in the audience was also, what is the specific institutional setting in Denmark that has led to other institutions and procedures? Of course, we have Jürgen from the Climate Council here. But also there was a question about a citizens' assembly that did feed into the climate policies. And perhaps before I go to others, I'm going to ask you, Andrew, whether you have looked at this a little bit, the climate governance, and perhaps also this aspect going beyond GDP, happiness. I don't know whether you have insights there. Is there something specific about the institutions, the approach in Denmark that you have noticed while working on it, where you said, oh yeah, this is probably also contributing to this broad consensus, to the ability to push forward with climate policies?
Thanks, Sid. I mean, certainly it was clear to us from our the missions we did virtually in Denmark that the role of independent institutions is very important. So I mentioned the Council on Climate Change and the Environmental Economics Council, but also the Citizens' Assembly, as mentioned, is something we also pick up on in the survey. That's something that France has been doing as well. And I think the quality of the analysis there, I mean, you could be cynical about who you get on that assembly, but the quality of what's come out of it has been really positive. So we reflect on that in the survey. The happiness and the GDP is something that the Environment Directorate in the OECD has been doing work on in terms of how should your climate policy look if what you're trying to do is trying to improve well-being, rather than we're not trying to maximise GDP given a goal for emissions, we're trying to maximise well-being. And so that leads you to some considerations like the importance of energy efficiency to actually reduce the use of energy, rather than just maximising the amount of energy, but making it cleaner. So that's certainly something that the OECD has been focusing on through the Environment Directorate. There was one other point that came up in amongst some of the discussion that I'll just pick up on while I've got the floor, about the Citizens' Assembly, but there's also a question about the taxation and whether that would be an increase in overall taxation or something that would be fiscally neutral. And we're quite clear in our economic survey that it should be fiscally neutral in terms of taxation. And there's two reasons for that. One is because of the acceptability concerns. If it just comes across as a tax grab, then that's not going to help that. And it's not going to compensate the vulnerable. And also you hope this is not a long-term tax base because you're hoping to reduce emissions. So just to pick up on that point in the comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. And I have my panel raising its actual virtual hands. I think Jürgen was first. Ida was there before, then she put it down, but it's up again. So I'll take Ida and then Katharina. So Jürgen, you had a point to make here. And perhaps while I can add the question that, because that's something that the new government reflects upon here also, how to organize advisory councils so that they really have an impact, because Germany has many of them, but sometimes, you know, they report to a specific ministry. It's not necessarily being picked up in the economic discussions. And that's something, at least as a point in the coalition agreement, that they want to work on that. So it would be interesting to hear how it works in Denmark, sorry, and how you feel the impact is driven there.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to see everything through rose-tinted glasses, but I think it is the case that there's a relatively widespread confidence in the Danish population that valid concerns in relation to planning, etc., they will be taken into account. And that means that you do not see quite the same tendencies as in some other countries. I'll not speak about Germany, but in some other countries to sort of weaponize the court system and try to just hold up everything. There's a general acceptance that there is a process for airing discontent, and when that is over, there is a decision as to what to do, and then one implements it. And I think perhaps a reason for that, and this comes back to what Andrew mentioned, is that we have these independent institutions that are taken seriously by people, of which the Council on Climate Change is one. And actually, and this is just for information for the German audience, it's true that it's an institution that has been in existence for the past 20 years, but it recently got a new mandate as part of the very much beefed up revision of the Danish climate law, so that now the Danish Climate Council no longer just has an advisory function. That was the case previously, that we could take up this, that, and the other issue and issue learned reports, and that may have affected the discussion to some extent, and may have helped to establish consensus on some things. But what is new with the climate law that was enacted 2 years ago is that we now have a sort of statutory role in terms of assessing, is the government on track to reach the targets that are set out in law for Danish climate policy. And we also have a statutory role in giving comments whenever the government issues strategy documents, whenever the government issues projections on climate developments. And I think basically you can see that as an attempt to change the climate Council on Climate Change from having a purely advisory role to also have a role in terms of what we could call sort of keeping the feet to the fire. I think that is a new role for us, and this is only 2 years old, so it's too early to claim that it has been a success. But at least it has generated quite some debate a year ago, when we pronounced that we actually did not think the government was on track to reach its targets. We're going to issue a new report on that next month, so I'll be a bit coy in my assessments today as to whether we'll change the assessment. But in any case, I think it's an interesting institutional development.
Ida, you raised your hand. You had something to say, but just to take up this point from Katharina, the planning procedures, and Jürgen already said something. He said, well, there's a lot of trust in the procedure that legitimate concerns can be heard, but then people will also say, okay, now we've settled the plan, the project, and now we somehow have to live with it. And in Germany, it's often seen that, you know, these court procedures can go on and on, but also the planning procedure is quite complex, not very transparent. From what I understand, sometimes with the very big investment projects, they're actually passed as a law in Denmark, and sometimes Germany looks at it and asks, so could that be a solution, because then actually interference later on would be limited a little bit. But I believe what you would need is this high level of trust before that. So if there's something you want to reflect upon as a lawmaker, that would be also interesting. But first, your comment, of course.
Yeah, thank you very much. Oh, there's so much I would want to say. I think to answer some of Katharina's questions, I came from the very Green Party movement side, where we wanted to be ambitious, quick, you know, have very high targets and just move. And what I've learned by 20 years in climate policies is really that backlashes. So unless you make it in an economically very smart way, unless you bring people on board, unless you listen to those who are against you or your opponents, you will end up being delayed. So for me, I've become a lot more pragmatic with 20 years in climate policies. And that also brings me to, when you look at planning, and the first thing I would fix if I was Germany was opening up your electricity grid, because it's a big problem for the rest of us. The reason why we could make this transition so cheap with wind energy is that we integrated our electricity system with Sweden, with Norway, with the Netherlands, so that when we have not enough wind, we can buy electricity from Norway. On the other hand, when we have too much wind, they use it to pump back their water in their hydro system. And that whole integration is very hard for us to make with the Southern Europe because of Germany, because you have a lot of private or your utilities and those who own your electricity grids, you have to really work with them. And that's not impacting normal people everyday life. This is something where you have to really be very strong with some of the interest in this system, and that would be very helpful, and it's going to make your transition much cheaper. So really, and EU is, by the way, telling you to do it. So get that fixed as number one. Secondly, I would say on the planning procedures, it's true, some of our biggest projects are now made as laws. I am not convinced that that is benefiting the trust and the transparency that we are talking about, because we do see a lot of opposition at the moment. But I also think that's a period of our time, because Facebook and the way you can mobilize around, being against things is exploding. So it's hard to build anything at the moment. We feel like it's really, really hard with new projects because there are so much opposition anywhere, where it's NIMBYism everywhere. So there has to be a really clear focus on the goal. Thirdly, I would say, I think Germany is leading on rooftop solar. So I think we can learn from you there. The only problem is that individual solar panels are very much more expensive than when you do it utility-wise. So it's a balance on getting people on board, having each their little energy plant, which is very expensive, versus this is very important for the person to see, I'm contributing. Here's my electrical vehicle being charged by my solar panel. So that is, I really think, is some kind of dilemma because it is often more expensive, but it is very important that it's clear to people that they're part of this. But I'm not going to be an expert on your planning laws. We have a lot of experience on rewarding people if they're part of, if they're getting a wind turbine in their neighborhood. I think really, really reward the local community, give them ownership, go to Scotland. They just built some very big wind farms, and looking at nature around these wind farms in some areas where nature is very poor, you can actually restore nature under these wind farms onshore. So I think going to Scotland and maybe also having a conversation with us on rewarding people for renewables would be the way to go. On the happiness side, again, yeah, happiness is great. This is, I think, equality in Denmark is really an important part of our happiness. But I have to mention energy prices. So again, this is why we have to look at why do we still have biomass power plants, and why we will still have it for a while is that we should use them as little as possible, but they're necessary to balance out when there's not enough wind. And we have to look at backup for electricity in all of Europe, or we will be too vulnerable for the Russians that are actually now pushing up gas prices, which is giving a lot of problems. So if we were to do one of the things that OECD is saying, you know, get rid of biomass, getting the incentives right, we would have to put a taxation on biomass at this time, which I think is very hard in these months where energy prices are just going through the roof. So sometimes this, again, something we did, which was for you know, transforming all of Europe's energy system, has also given us some problems. Though mentioning that the green transition has saved Europe, I think it's about 50 billion euros the last 3 or 4 months, because renewables is so more cheap than natural gas and oil. So of course we should continue down that road, but we have to think about energy security and energy prices so we will not lose people along the way. What we've done is that every time we've had higher prices on water and electricity, taxation on that, we've also had some kind of subsidy or green check for average households to pay for like their basic consumption. So those who really pay for the higher taxes are those who have a very much higher use of energy and water, and that's often richer families. So you get sort of like a deduction for basic income. I think that's very, very important to keep people happy. And then looking at happiness, it's much more about equality. It's much more about education. It's much more about health, and seeing yourself as a leader in the green transition on top of that. And thirdly would be a short comment to pick up on what Jürgen said on the institutions. I'm very happy that you think the Climate Council is working, Jan. I personally, together with the minister, invented this process where we would get beaten up every year by the Climate Council saying that and that and that's not good enough. But I think it's been very important for the credibility of the whole government. And I also think it's important that the council is fair, because we are actually doing quite a lot at this moment. We are more than halfway to our climate goals, and the population actually believes that nothing is happening. To be honest, we are getting a lot of beating at home because whatever the Climate Council says is being, you know, also used and abused by the opposition. So I think that's one problem we have, that the population cannot see how much is actually happening. More things have been happening the last 2 years in Denmark than the previous 20 years. And I'm not sure the population knows this. And I would urge Jan to make sure that next time you have a report that people also really understand that we are moving, even though we're not fully there. Just to mention the Environmental Economics Council that Andrew talked about has been important to understand for many people, not least for the Ministry of Finance, that if we go down the road of subsidies reaching our targets, it's going to be much more expensive than if we use taxation. I think it's around 6 billion euros a year more expensive to go down the road of only using subsidies versus going down using taxation. So an independent economic council like that has really impacted the discussion also inside the ministries, because that's my last point. Get the Ministry of Finance on board. You really need to get them to understand this is part of their job. You have to have this ambitious goal, and it has to be their problem if you don't reach it. So that is a place where we still have some way to go, where the Ministry of Finance has to understand that they will pay the bill in the end, unless we make it some of the smarter ways, instead of working against and looking only at short-term efficiency and savings.
Thank you, Ida. That was really a lot of insight and very showed that you know what's happening in Germany, where Germany can learn from some Danish experiences. Katharina, you had points before, and probably you have more now. So you have the floor. Actually, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks a ton already for all the aspects. I find it very, very enriching, the discussion. And maybe if you observed, let's say, a bit the fight between the Liberals and the Greens around the Ministry of Finance, we are well aware of the relevance of the Ministry of Finance. Now, we have the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate, and work closely with the Ministry of Finance that Christian Lindner, the Liberal Party leader, has now taken over as a minister. I am now the spokesperson for finance of the Green Party and leading our finance policies in the parliament. Because yes, this is extremely important and I agree totally. So thanks as well for pinpointing to that. And this is also why I'm so much interested in the taxonomy aspects and how to not only fuel or get private capital into the right direction, but it has to be private and state-owned capital. Also, thanks a lot again for the grid aspect. And yes, there we have a bit of a structural problem. I do have another question, or let's say observation and question with regards to heating. I mean, a lot of CO2 emissions come from heating, and we have much more than you in Denmark are still dependent on gas-based. It's nearly half of our households, and oil-based, it's nearly a third of our households still based there. And we saw something around district heating, which is fueled by 61%, I guess, from renewable energies in Denmark. And most households are connected to this district heating. And maybe this is too detailed and too technical for this group, but I would still like to continue maybe the discussion around that, because heating has such a big impact on climate. And maybe you have one, let's say, high level suggestion already there, what we can, if we can learn, if you do as well think that this is a success story, as from what I observe from outside. And if you say yes, then maybe there's one tip already that you can give us here. And last but not least, as well, with regards to whom to get on board, I'm a big fan of your series Borgen, and I think Borgen is coming to a next. I will continue learning from the Danish policies also there. Of course, it's fictional, but I just as a maybe a humoristic side note here as well. But district heating, I think, is something. We don't only have to talk about power generation, but also heating, and as well for our industry, this has a very big impact. Thanks.
Thank you, Katharina. And Ida raised her hand when we talked about district heating. I do have district heating on my list and also skills, but I want to go to Wilfried first, who raised his hand and see what he wanted to do. And then actually I will distribute these 2 points in the group again. Wilfried, you had a point, and I did want to ask you also from, again, to because now we're comparing a lot Denmark and Germany. You quite rightly made the point that most of this is global issues. So perhaps you want to talk a bit about, you know, global policy instruments, pricing, of course, but also the EU perspective, what to think about when we look forward for these 2 countries and indeed all other countries.
I was rather going now to use the chance to learn as well and to ask Ida more questions. First, I would like to say I really support what you said previously. So we really need that in print. That was very good. I would also like to emphasize to got not too much lost on this happiness track. So we should not forget that Denmark is very rich, so they can afford a lot of transition. On the period we are looking at from 1990 to 2019, Denmark had even a stronger growth in GDP if you look at power purchasing parities than Germany, so they can afford it. And that's always an important point. And what I think what we really can learn here in Europe is that Denmark seems to have a very, I would say, pragmatic and innovative approach to address problems. So really, what is at stake? What do we need to do? So there are always innovative projects, which I would be happy to see them happening in Germany or other countries, like, for example, their offshore wind farms. They have now ideas about having carbon neutral flights inbound in Denmark. But it's not only about being hygge in their own country. It's also, I perceive them as very innovative when it comes to European policy. So they had, together with the other Nordic countries, and proposal to include negative emissions in the EU emission trading scheme, and clearly show that this is not either way. It's not renewables or negative emissions. We do need to do both of that. And they, I think, have really a good compromise on what needs to be done, and they really follow the science and do not just use it as a parole, so to say. And that brings me then to my two questions regarding and paying it for it. So if my information is correct, so Denmark has a similar electricity price for households in Germany, but a much lower price for industry. I read fund figures the lowest in Europe, and I do not know how you do that. So we would be happy to learn about that. And the second question is, I was a bit surprised that you had to say that you want to reduce your biomass production, because from the numbers I know, you want to increase them. So, or maybe it's just the share. So maybe you foresee a stronger reduction in gas consumption overall, but the share of biomass is supposed to increase to 75% until 2030. So, or maybe I just have a wrong source, and that then relates to, or related. Are you thinking then of combining biomass with CCS and have BECCS, like Sweden is currently, or this year, launching their reverse auction scheme on buying this electricity from BECCS facilities? So that would be my question. If you could point me there to some sources, I would be thankful.
So these are many questions to Ida, and we have only 2 minutes left, but maybe you can go a little bit longer, unless people have to run after this. Now I have 4 questions from the panel raised, but I think I'm going to go to the one person who hasn't raised his hand, which is Andrew first, because I just want to pick up on 2 things that we discussed. One was district heating, and I'm sure Ida has much to say about how they did it, how Denmark did it, but I remember us discussing that Sweden there is really even further ahead, and you correct me if I'm wrong. And my understanding is that's also thanks to their very early adoption of CO2 prices. So perhaps if you have a word to say on that, that would be great. And happiness in a very practical way. I remember you also saying that the skills policies are really good in Denmark. So helping people to transform their skills in order to adapt to the economic changes that are coming from ambitious climate policies. So perhaps you can make 2 short points on that, Andrew, before I go to Ida and then the others.
Sure, I'll try to be quick. So district heating is something that we clearly thought is very important in Denmark, and because of how efficient it can be, it has contributed to reducing emissions, and shifting over to biomass has reduced emissions as well. But what we see that Sweden's done, we think, better than Denmark, is they have opened up the heat generation part of the district heating, the contestable part, rather than the natural monopoly part of the district, and that's allowed more large-scale electric heat pumps to be provided by private providers to provide the district heating rather than biomass-fired combined heat and power. So that's something where we were thinking Denmark could learn from Sweden. But I think the point Ida made about reliability of the electricity system is very important as well. Now, if you get these power to X technologies that can use power when there's excess power, then maybe that gives you more flexibility on the demand side. But until that happens, take the point that biomass continues to be important to support the reliability of the electricity system, with so much renewables in Denmark, notwithstanding the links to the rest of the Nordic system. On the skills, so this is something we grappled with a lot in the process of the survey. It's clear that the structural adjustment will be big, but given that it's been focused on energy in the past, it's hard to sort of extrapolate as to how many jobs will be lost, where they'll be lost. But I guess what gave us confidence in Denmark is looking at the historical experience with the flex security system, as we talk about it, in terms of having a fairly flexible labour market system that meant, for example, in the global financial crisis, there were quite a lot of jobs lost in manufacturing, but the strong active labour market programs and the retraining enable that to be overcome quickly without a long-term increase in unemployment. So we see that being favourable for the big structural adjustment associated with climate policy in the future as well.
Thank you, Andrew. And I can't remember my sequence, but perhaps I'll continue with Jürgen before I go to Ida and Katarina now.
Okay, thank you very much. Just 2 points relating to what Wilfried raised. First, on the low price of electricity for enterprises vis-a-vis households, which in a sense reflects something that has been a long-standing issue in Denmark, the concern about competitiveness. So taxation at the enterprise level of electricity has just been very much lower than at the household level. And this concern about competitiveness, which seems a bit bizarre for a country that runs a current account surplus of 8% of GDP and has net foreign assets of 80% of GDP, but nevertheless, it's there. This is, of course, the flip side of concerns about leakage. And here I think there is one important aspect that needs to be factored in going forward, which is the new and much more ambitious EU policy, the Fit for 55 program. Of course, we haven't seen the final version yet, but if it is going to resemble what the Commission so far has proposed, I think it's likely that leakage is going to be much less of a concern and much less of a constraint on national policies going forward than may have been the case in the past. So that'll be one argument for going slow that's going to perhaps disappear or at least be less prominent in the future. So I think that's something really to watch. Final point, Wilfried, you also mentioned both biomass and BECCS. And I think here one thing one needs to try to do, which is actually quite difficult, is to, in the pursuit of the policies that are focused on the immediate or medium-term future, 2030 to a large extent in Denmark, one should avoid doing something which conflicts with where one wants to go in the long term. In the long term, we want to go for net zero. And if we want to go for net zero, and most countries actually do want to go for net zero, that means that there will have to be some sequestration of carbon dioxide taking place through CCS. And if you want that to take place, and if you do not believe that overnight direct air capture is going to become incredibly cheap, which is, I guess, quite unlikely, that means that BECCS is more or less the only game in town. But if you want to use BECCS in order to sequestrate carbon dioxide in the future, that means the biomass will not be available for a number of other purposes, not least PTX. So I think at the moment there's quite some enthusiasm for carbon-based fuels generated through PTX in Denmark. And I could see that as a risk going forward, that at the end of the day, we're just not going to have the biomass to get the carbon-based electrofuels that are meant to come out of the PTX. So I think basically the point I want to make is, when doing something in the near and medium term, think about the long term. Thanks.
Very important point. And Ida was now raising her actual hand in addition to her virtual hand. So maybe Ida, you can go first, and then we come to Katharina, and to the end also, unfortunately, although I think we could discuss another hour.
Yeah, just first of all, I agree on basically almost everything Jørgen said. I'm not sure that the PTX we're looking for should be biomass based. I think the electrofuels should come from renewable electricity, and then maybe the CO2 captured in some of our CCS plants can be used for the methane. But that's a very technical, long discussion, and I think we will avoid it here. Just to add on what Jørgen is saying about the Fit for 55 and the lower leakage, we should also add the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where EU will actually also try to prevent leakage out of the EU. So I think that is really dramatically changing the discussion on leakage. And to be fair, I think we've had too low energy prices on our industry to answer Wilfried, because some of them just did not transition in any way. So that's what we're trying to change now with our CO2 taxation reform that we will make this year. Just a few things on district heating. First of all, energy efficiency goes along hand in hand with district heating. So because you have to have pretty dense houses in order to have a district heating system that is really smart and functional, you should not have too much leakage in the houses. So insulating houses, getting incentives placed for that, buildings overall, and then adding a district heating system in all the areas where the population or the industry is close enough that it makes economic sense. So in those areas, district heating is mandatory. You have to be on the grid. We are trying to get away for biomass for some reasons, but it's difficult because the taxation is skewed. And that's a long story, I'll spare you. But getting the district heating on heat pumps, which is very smart because you can make system integration where the wind is blowing too much. You can actually store that wind in the district heating system by hiring the temperature a few degrees. So you can actually store quite a lot of electricity with heat pumps in a district heating system. So you don't have to send it around to the whole world. You integrate those systems. Getting the excess heat from all the heavy industry you have, putting that in the district heating system, getting geothermal to work and solar to work in the district heating system. Then you don't have to put in as much biomass as we've been doing, and only use the biomass for backup. And of course, having CCS to capture the CO2 on the other end will be the smart way to go. And then you can start in areas that are more dispersed to have, bans on new boilers on natural gas and on oil. So instead giving people subsidies for installing heat pumps also in those areas. Sometimes you can even just find an economic model where you pay not up front, but you pay along the line for the district heating or the heat pump, and it's actually less expensive than natural gas and oil. And I think people seeing their energy bills exploding in this moment are often also people with individual boilers, so they should have an incentive to go to heat pumps driven by green electricity. So I hope you will go that way along with us. And then just thank you for a great conversation, and we could go on, I think, and it's just very important learning from each other. And we're definitely not perfect in Denmark, but we try to learn and think in an integrated way and see the steps, like Jørgen said, the midterm steps should be with a long-term perspective.
Yeah, that's great. And I do agree, it's a very fruitful exchange. Now, Katharina had to wait so long, so I'm looking forward to your points, your questions, perhaps final questions. And I think, unfortunately, then we'll have to close.
Yeah, I do have one last question and one remark. And the question, we don't have to answer it today, but when I looked into the very large share of biofuels and waste in your energy production, a question was raised regarding the link between circular economy and our let's say, debate around energy production, and maybe that's a topic also for a next phase, because the connection between CO2, climate, energy, and circular economy and all the material flows and how we could then use them, I think that would be great. Also digging a bit deeper into the debate we saw about biomass as well. I think that would be really fruitful. But just as a, let's say, question we don't have to answer today, maybe. But we do also, with the new government, have a very strong will to become much more active with regards to circular economy. We are very good in recycling somehow, but not really using the wealth that is within the waste. One remark, and why I raised my hand, was that I had a bit the feeling that the defeat was a bit around, but happiness, let's not overestimate it. And I hope I do understand it correctly. Why did I join? It's making lives better for people, and that's a bit also the motto of OECD in a way: better policies for better lives. And so I do think we should link it better, what we do with regards to economic and fiscal policies, with well-being of people. And this is what I am here for, that people are happier. And yes, there is a direct link that with regards to a certain threshold, you need more money and income. Until then, it's directly linked. But why do we want growth? In the beginning, it was the feeling, growth, it makes the cake bigger and everybody gets something from the cake, that gets bigger. So people are happier and well-being is increased, and this trickle-down effect has been proven not to be that true. So I do believe that when we look into measuring how successful our policies are, looking into the well-being of people, in addition to also looking into their economic situation, is an important aspect to see if our policies are successful.
Yes, thank you. I think, and I think, although there are questions now about circular economy, but I would say we have to have another event about circular economy, unless Ida wants to add a small point. But I think what you said now was a very good closing, because of course, why do we do this? The climate transition and also striving for economic well-being is that people have good lives, and the perhaps just as an information, the new economic and climate minister wants to go beyond growth in the what we call the annual economic report that he presents. So and it's something the OECD is working on. So I think it's a nice closing for a very broad and informative discussion. I have to say, I really like the format where two countries talk to each other, because then new questions and more concrete questions come up. I think we might do it again. And thank you, everyone, Wilfried, Jörgen, Ida, Katharina, and Andrew, for participating. Thank you also to the audience. I really learned a lot. I enjoyed it, and I hope we can do more of this. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you too for the invitation, and thanks for the great exchange with the others as well.
Yeah. Thank you too for me. Great talking to you.